With so much going on today relative to drug policy, what motivated you to explore the history in Assassin of Youth that stretches back over a century? What was its relevance to you?
I was motivated to write this book by a series of simple, stark, and easily available observations about the prison industrial complex in the United States, namely that there are more prisoners per capita in the U.S. than in any other country, that our prison population is disproportionately composed of young African American and Latino men, and that they are in shocking numbers doing time for minor nonviolent drug offenses. The legal mechanism for the criminal justice practices that produce this situation is drug prohibition, or what we call the war on drugs. So given this situation, which I think is a bad one, I wanted to look back and figure out how did we get to this place.
Harry Anslinger was the first commissioner of the Bureau of Narcotics back in 1930. What impact did he have on the drug policy that continues to affect us today?
So I think the phrase war on drugs is familiar to most people in the United States, and if people have further familiarity with it, they may associate it with Richard Nixon, who touted the phrase in the early 1970s, and maybe even the concurrent Rockefeller drug laws. But in fact, harsh laws that carry heavy offenses, heavy penalties for nonviolent drug offenses, very severe penalties for compound offenders, and mandatory minimum sentencing, which are the three tenets of the war on drugs. Those tenets actually go back much further than Nixon. They were already instituted in the early 1950s in the Boggs Act and related legislation, and they had before that been pushed by Harry J. Anslinger in his capacity as Commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. So the war on drugs goes back in this country a very long way.
And he was central to its establishment.
He was absolutely central. He was commissioner from 1930, when the Bureau was established, until his resignation in 1962. So he had over 30 years in that office to institute federal legislation that was prohibitionist in nature. And he entered the office, not coincidentally, just as alcohol prohibition was on the wane. And so the transition from alcohol prohibition to drug prohibition, I think, is a critical part of the history of the war on drugs as well.
I should point out for interested readers, this is certainly a critical history of a central part of our more recent history, and continues, as you say, to resonate today. But it is a treatment that is complete with wordplay, with digressions, with fictitious characters. And some people might conclude that to a subject as serious as the government's war on drugs, that treatment maybe in some way diminishes the seriousness. How do you respond to a contention like that?
So, of course, I take the war on drugs very seriously. That's why I wanted to write about it. The trouble with Anslinger was that he was a harsh disciplinarian. He did not allow a lot of evidence in to muddy his simplistic evaluation of how drug traffic worked, who was responsible for it, who was victimized by it, what the social costs of it were. He had a pretty simple understanding of the matter and never sought to complicate it with the facts. So in writing about Anslinger, it seemed important to me to reject some of the ways of thinking that he used that led to harsh disciplinary policy that is actually ineffective at reducing, much less eliminating, drug traffic and drug consumption. So I wanted to write about Harry in an unusual way because we already know a lot about Harry J. Anslinger's career, and we know a lot about the law and policy, and yet we still don't know how to change the law and policy in ways that would be just and humane. So it seemed to me that it was important to try to know about the law and the policy and Anslinger himself in a new way, in a different way, to try to know differently so that we can try to generate different law and policy.
Anything else you think critical for people to understand this, Alex?
Yeah, so I'll give an example. One of the things that Anslinger was so expert at, he was considered a propagandist. He had a lot of access to bully pulpits, whether he gave talks to law enforcement officials or social clubs or ladies' auxiliaries or associations of pharmacologists. He also had access to publishing editorials in Hearst newspapers. So he had a lot of ways to get his ideas about, and one of the things that he did so cleverly was to connect in the public mind certain drugs with certain populations. This had already been done before Anslinger in the late 19th century with an association between Chinese immigrants and opium, but Anslinger perfected the art by associating marijuana with Latinos and then with African Americans, particularly jazz musicians. And we saw similar associations being made even after Anslinger had retired and in fact died with the epidemic of crack cocaine. So if you know that one of the things that was so effective that Anslinger did to support the war on drugs, the criminalization of entire populations in association with the war on drugs, you know that it's important to look back at those linkages, to look back at his language, to begin to peel back some of the code words we now call dog whistles when we hear them in public political discourse. And so playing with the language is very relevant and in fact necessary to trying to understand how Harry J. Anslinger thought, which is to say, what are the deep logics of Prohibition?